On the 17th of May 1914, the third and final battleship of the Conte di Cavour class was delivered to the Riga Marina and was commissioned into the Navy. It was named Leonardo da Vinci. At the start of World War I, the Italians moved Leonardo da Vinci to a mooring in Mar Piccolo, which was a part of Taranto harbor. While it was at Taranto, the Italians believed the ship was safe from outside attack, and nothing catastrophic could happen to it, but this would change on the 2nd of August, 1916. Leonardo da Vinci was peacefully sitting at its mooring until the evening when suddenly a large explosion erupted out from the after two turrets, and the ship began taking on water. A large fire erupted on the after end of the ship, and damage control teams actually attempted to contain the flames, but the battleship began listing to port, and within 10 minutes of the explosion, it had capsized and come to rest on the bottom of the harbor. A total of 248 men had been killed in the explosion and subsequent sinking. The Italian Navy was taken by surprise, and they quickly ordered an investigation to decipher what had actually happened to Leonardo da Vinci, and an examination of the sunken hulk was quickly carried out, where it was found that the ship had not yet settled. The lower bow of the battleship was still sticking above the water, and the first measurement taken showed that the keel was about 5 meters above the waterline, but over the upcoming days, this number would steadily reduce. The battleship was still driving itself down in the soft mud of Mar Piccolo, and by the time it had finally settled, the keel only had about 3.5 meters clearance of the waterline. Ultimately, the stern was the deepest part of the wreck, and it was roughly 15 meters below the water's surface. Dive teams would be sent down to explore the after end of the ship, since this is where the explosion was reported to have occurred, and upon looking at the upper hull and deck, these were completely submerged in the mud and nothing could be seen. However, the lower hull was visible, and two large holes, one on port and one on starboard, of the aftermost 305mm main battery turret magazine was visible. Both holes were similar in size, being roughly 10 meters long and 5 meters tall. These two holes would have allowed immediate flooding of the aftermost magazines, and since the vessel was not in any kind of action readiness, all of its watertight doors and hatches were open, and this allowed progressive flooding to take over the ship, which eventually resulted in the loss of stability and the capsizing of the vessel. What was less clear about the sinking of the ship was what actually caused the explosion. The Italian Navy took two sides in specific. They either believed that the ship was sabotaged by Austro-Hungarian saboteurs, or they sided with spontaneous combustion. For those whom are not familiar with spontaneous combustion, this is a phenomenon where an item can randomly burst into flames without an apparent external source of heat causing the affected item to light on fire, aka it lights itself on fire either through a chemical makeup or some kind of alteration internally. Since the sinking, another theory has been proposed that the explosion was caused by improper handling of the ammunition, whether this had been done by Leonardo da Vinci's crew in specific, or whether it was an issue with procedure in the Italian Navy. Unfortunately, in almost every case where a ship explodes from a primary magazine detonation, all of the evidence has been destroyed, and there's no real way of determining what actually caused the explosion. By the end of their inquiries, the Riga Marina published that they believe the ship was lost as the result of an act of sabotage. Merely a week after the explosion on the 11th of August 1916, the Navy was asking for proposals to raise the wreck so that the ship could actually be put back into service. 4 primary proposals were considered: building a caisson around the ship so that repairs could be carried out on the hull and it would be refloated, digging a trench around the ship in which it could be slid into and steadily righted and then eventually refloated, using a multitude of ships to hold the Da Vinci while compressed air was pumped into it and it steadily refloated, or steadily patching up the hull and pumping compressed air into the ship, refloating it upside down, and then flipping it upright when the time was necessary. In November of 1916, it was decided to go with option 4, as this gave more control over the raising process, as the Navy could choose which sections of the ship would remain flooded and which sections would be drained out, so the ship's motions would be predictable. In December of 1916, materials were collected, and in early 1917, work began as decompression chambers were attached to the exterior of the ship's hull, and dive teams entered the lower hull and made sure that watertight compartments were sealed. Once these initial preparations were complete, compressed air would be forced into the ship's compartments, which would force the water out of the compartments, and the Da Vinci steadily began to rise. By the summer of 1917, the hull had been raised enough to where teams could enter the vessel and empty the ammunition within the forward and amidship magazines, and the coal was also removed from the vessel's bunkers. By late 1917, the ship had been raised a few meters, making a noticeable impact, but there were still two primary problems hindering the recovery operation: the two gaping holes in the stern of the ship and the main battery turrets. Dive teams would be assembled to attack both problems at the same time. Two teams would work on the stern of the ship, patching up the two holes so that water could not re-enter through those holes, and other teams were sent to the bottom to ensure that the turrets did fall out of their barbettes and that they would rest on the bottom of the harbor to be recovered at a later date. In order to ensure that the turrets did not get stuck within their barbettes, compressed air and water was pumped in and out of the ship, raising and lowering the hull so it could be shifted around, ensuring that the turrets fell out. By January and February of 1918, the turrets were safely out of their barbettes, and the number 2 barbette was removed from the ship along with the forward superstructure in order to lighten the ship as much as possible. By the time that work was completed, the normally 23,500-ton battleship was closer to 18,000 tons. By mid-1918, the hull had been raised enough to where all holes in the hull could be patched, including the decking around the aftermost barbettes, and the ship's hull could be made watertight once again. 8 flotation cylinders were then attached to the ship in 4 pairs of 2 pairs on the port and starboard bow, and 2 pairs on the port and starboard stern. These would initially be filled with water, but then this water would be forced out by compressed air, and this would offset the remaining flooded compartments within the ship and allow it to be completely raised. On the 4th of June 1919, the forward pairs were emptied of water, and the bow was once again refloated. And finally, on the 17th of September 1919, the after tanks were emptied, and Leonardo da Vinci was afloat once again. The ship was towed into a dry dock where specially prepared shoring had been installed in order to hold the upside-down hull, and the ship would be drained of all water by the 5th of October 1919. For the next year, Leonardo da Vinci would remain in the dry dock while the remains of the deceased crew were removed, sections of the bow were reconstructed, and the holes in the hull were repaired. Once all the holes were repaired, the ship would be repainted, and it was moved out of the dry dock on the 21st of January 1921 and moved into a trench that was roughly 20 meters deep. Water was then pumped into the starboard tanks of the double bottom, and the Da Vinci began to roll over, and by the end of the operations, the vessel was almost sitting upright. It had roughly a 45-degree list to starboard. Over the next few days, the ship's hull began to right itself even further, and by the 24th of January 1921, the starboard list had reduced to 22 degrees. By adjusting the water in the double bottom, the ship was reduced to a 0-degree list, and for the first time in 5 years, it was finally sitting upright. The hull was moved back into a dry dock, and it would remain there for the next several years while the 5 main battery gun turrets were recovered. On the 19th of February 1921, a commission convened in order to decide whether Leonardo da Vinci was worth repairing or not, with the primary topic at hand being cost. It would take 2 years for a decision to be made, and on the 12th of March 1923, it was decided that repairs were not worth carrying out. On the 22nd of November 1923, Leonardo da Vinci was removed from the operational register, and the hull was sent to Toronto for breaking up. It had cost 18 million lire to recover the ship. For the first time in its history, the Italian Navy lost a Dreadnought-era battleship. However, this was the first out of a string of battleships they would lose in the upcoming decades. However, the loss of the other Italian battleships is a story for another day. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.